Emiliano Reyes es egresado de la licenciatura en antropología de la
School of the UNAM University. He will speak about the museological proposals of cannabis in Mexico and Canada. Emiliano is here with us. Yes, thank you, Milo. Good afternoon. I'm going to be sharing screen.
¿Me podrían confirmar si ya la ven?
So can you see my screen? Yes, we can. Thank you, Emiliano.
Voy a dejar de compartir.
I'll stop sharing. I would like to start thanking Dr. Adam for having invited me, and Armando also for his openness for this discussion. Even though he could not be present today, he is a student of international affairs, and he's very much aware of the importance of the political positioning. And Mr. Emilio Servir, the founding member of the museum, and I'll be presenting information about what they're doing. Without the support, the ideas that we're presenting wouldn't be as clear. And thank everyone for their attendance. As Emilio said, my name is Emiliano Reyes. I studied anthropology at UNAM. I'm currently working my thesis of social representations of contemporary art in museums. So for the purposes of this presentation, Emilio, just 1 second. Could you come closer to the mic because there's a certain intermittence, and so that the translators can hear you well. Sure. Is this better? Yes, much better. For the purpose of this presentation, which is based on the article called Museological Proposals for Cannabis in Mexico and Canada, I focused on an interview to the Cáñamo and Marihuana Museum Julio Senil. And this is because of how important it is to speak about the institutional and the personal matters as we have seen today. To begin with, we should briefly track the genesis of what we know what a museum is. Museum started to be used in the 19th century, especially in Europe, with the purpose of showing to the world exotic collection. Obviously, this is hand in hand with anthropology. Museum has the original museum, which is a Greek word that means the home of the muses. So the idea of a museum has to do with a modern project that in Europe was created with the civilizing idea of nation states and the logics of capital to grant access to the population under the idea of progress. So a modern museum is established as an area of encyclopedic dominant culture. The institution was created as a place in which absolute certainties were supposed to be displayed through historical certainties for the classification of order in the collective imaginary of people. Museums and the way in which collections are presented have the intention of creating an illusion of having a correct representation of reality through the objects that they display and through the specific cultural, historical, or intersubjective context they present, so as to present abstract realities. And even though they are taken out of context, stigma is therefore double. So the creation of meaning, the classification of a museum, is created as supposed to be an accurate representation of others, a neutral one. Therefore, museums have been used to serve the modern logic of the West in the 20th century to construct the collective ideas of rankings and truths. As we had mentioned yesterday during the tables in the colloquium, through the art, this is how those imaginary concepts, collective concepts are created. Museums are created as an external space of the world, an entity that is capable of being abstracted from everyday activities. It is a figure that through a curation of collection tends to work with the political construction of a nation. However, the most clear purpose of a museum is that It is presented to be an open institution to represent diversity of a population that otherwise wouldn't be possible. And it is supposed to incorporate a variety of subjects from a nation, and it incorporates it in a hegemonic behavior or expectation. That's the definition of a museum. With the creation of the institution, museology, museography emerged. Important concepts that have to be differentiated. Museography is considered to be the study of the organization of the museum, and the museography is the techniques that museology uses. So museography is like the theory of what to do, and then museography, museology is the first, and museography is the techniques. In most of the inaccurate definitions that come in the theoretical discussions of the 20th century, museology would evolve with the development of museums in a general sense in France, where it was presented as a science in the creation of museums. Museology was accepted, as in France and other countries, as the case of Mexico. Unlike other countries, English-speaking countries that have a different system, in 2014, the Human Rights Museum established guidelines with two key trends in museology nowadays. One of them was the arrival of the so-called new museology that proposed a rethinking of museums from a position as places or authorities of knowledge that presented narratives of scientific and cultural evolution. Instead of, they became places of dialogue for the public with greater commitment to granting minorities voices. The novelty of this model is to provide more importance to the audiences, especially in educational purposes. And this is the new idea that we are presented with. The new museography considers the conditions of operation of the entity to be able to reflect what the possibilities are open up in the history, and from a perspective that is more participative. It is important to say that with globalization and decolonization, those processes have changed the way in which museums present themselves. Now, the different categories that were used before are now being transformed. So, according to Chilean anthropologist Carla Pinochet Logros, an artistic institution is a place for transformation, and she proposes a performative. To think of social discourses from a performance perspective means to ask what is the capability that they have to contribute to the construction of reality that they describe. So a performance bridge between society and reality is the way in which museums use their resources to have different social objectives, and in this specific case, to face the stigma of marijuana consumption. The proposal is for us to think of a museum as a place in which is creating a cultural reality, a place for the preservation, from which other external realities are absent, so as to highlight certain things and hide others, or provide different perspectives. It has to be contemporary to the interest of the society. Visitors shouldn't be imposed a rigid, authorized reading as passive subjects. The audiences can disagree and can have their own opinions. So understanding museums like this is important for us to understand how Julio Senil, the director of the Caño Marihuana Museum in Mexico, if we understand this, we can first approach the idea that his personal collection are important in institutional development. And this is where museums are embedded. Many times we think that, or we understand institutional things are abstract things, but those institutions are representing people, where our interest and relationships of power present. So in this sense, the relationships between hemp and the plant becomes center stage instead of the other features. And this is a relevant aspect of where we place attention. Museo Cáñamo is placed in the downtown area, Mexico City, Madero Street. It's on the first floor. It is a very small museum, really small. It was created in 1970 in Mexico City, in the Jardín Balbuena neighborhood. And the relationship of Julio Senil with his environment made him become aware of the presence of marijuana in his neighborhood ever since he started. This was a marginalized area where he grew up with a lot of discrimination and stigma. Julio Senil said that when he was 16 years old, he started consuming marijuana. He had an experience where he was arrested, and that when he got arrested, that's when he was offered marijuana, and so that he realized that was a contradiction between inside the justice system. Then he read the book, the Great Book of Hemp, where he saw how the plant was used. For instance, in Cristobal Colon used it for his ships when he discovered America, etc. Julio Senil became a photographer, and because of his skills, he was able to look at things differently. From an artistic perspective, he made a documentary of cannabis, and this documentary was screened in Europe in different places, and this is how he found the museum in Amsterdam, the Cannabis Museum in Amsterdam, by realizing that this existed, because in 1985, Amsterdam was the first place where a museum of cannabis was open, and then Barcelona in 2012, I think. This is how Julio got the idea to explain the history of the plant. The philosophy of museum is to educate about the plant so as to not be afraid of it, to get rid of the prejudice and to lose the evil propaganda around it. And with its collaboration with the Cáñamo magazine, that's how he was inspired to create this museum in Mexico, started in 2017, to commemorate the anniversary of the magazine. The magazine has an international nature. Cáñamo was created in Spain and is shared in Colombia, Chile, and Mexico for the last 6 years. It is a magazine where you read about medicine, and there's also a Q&A session for specialists and other subjects. There are legal discussions, commercial discussions of what's happening in Mexico and other countries like Canada. And there are also advertising that happens, and it's about fertilizers or pots for pot, as well as alternatives for how to work with it better. In 2017, there was a large earthquake in Mexico City, and an article was published about marijuana for PTSD. And the tetrahydrocannabinol substance was described in this role for this type of usage. If you see the picture, it says the executive illustration. This is a series of materials that show how the plants are treated, and it can be very pedagogical. The opening of the museum was in April 2017, and as of then, it became an important place in Colonia Roma, Mexico City, and afterwards, it's also visited the Chamber of Representatives and Senate. Its final location has been relocated in Madero Street. And last Wednesday, they had their 3rd anniversary of being there. The same line is followed in Mexico and other places. The idea is to show how much ignorance there's around this plant. This is a plant that has accompanied the communities for centuries, but has been forbidden for the last century. And it is because of ignorance, because it is considered to be an evil plant, when in reality it is not banned, and its restriction affects the textile, the pharmacological, and other interests. So according to the pictures, there are different displays where food and products that can be produced with the plant, backpacks, beers, medicine, and clothes, because the use of the plant, it can be very varied. There are also a creation of biodegradable plastics with the plant. Textiles are are stronger than cotton, and cosmetics that are also made by the oil, which is very beneficial for the skin. The Marijuana Museum has specialized books, and there are also issues of the Cáñamo magazine. So my final reflection would be, going back to what Mr. Julio says, that from the prohibition starts stigmatization, this bridge between visual arts and stigma is very important, since This is a cultural assumption. In the arts should be used as an extension to facilitate consumption and communication. It's all about questioning what is the role that art is playing in our times as a privileged participant, and what are the consequences of specific artistic representations that limit ideas, thinking about intersectionality. Yesterday we heard the feminist cannabis activist. When we see that there's a lot of stigma around cannabis and the art, artists are obliged to have a political stand that limits their viewpoint. So we should think about the uses of medicinal plants and illegal substances under the light of how useful it could be for new purposes. And to conclude, I believe that this analysis should be addressed to the people who um, are against, because stigmatization is very prevalent, and it is important for us to rethink how to socialize and how to represent the plant in new ways. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Emiliano. Our next presenter in this table is Jorge Rubio Morales, entrepreneur of the cannabis industry. Jorge's here with us now. Are you around? Yes. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to start sharing.
¿Ya ven la presentación?
Can you see my screen? Yes, we can now.
Bien, muchas gracias.
Okay, thank you so much.
Primera vez.
I feel very honored to participate in an academic event of this level. I'm participating for the first time, so I'd like to thank the CISEN, the people from the university, and everybody else. I live in Canada, but when I was in Mexico, I participated in many courses from the university and also from the University of Colorado. I like this space because it's been completely different from other spaces that have addressed this topic in recent years in Mexico. I think this is the first time that two institutions of this level have this kind of meeting. It's a very deep encounter, and it has participants from different countries, activists, academics, business people, and I like that a lot because I had never participated in a forum like this one in Mexico or even in other countries like Canada, where I live. So, brief introduction. I've been living in Canada for 4 or 5 years. My goal in moving to Canada was to understand firsthand the cannabis industry, the Canadian cannabis industry. It was not regulated 5 years ago as opposed to now. And that was my goal, to get a firsthand understanding and to get experience about the industry, about the activists, about the Canadian cannabis culture, specifically in British Columbia and Vancouver. And it's been a great discovery, a great adventure. I've discovered a lot of things. The legacy, the industry is growing, the culture, the activism, the stigma, the consumers, and people who have been at it for a long time. I think Canada and British Columbia in general is one of the main sites for cannabis culture in North America. Of course, the legacy growers who remained in an illegal market for many years. So this experience has been fascinating. Then I had the opportunity of working in different companies, planting the seed. I worked in trimming, packaging, even on retail. And after many years working in the industry and understanding everything that was happening, I was able to associate myself with different business groups from the US and Canada, and then enter the industry as a businessman. But this is not about business, it's about something else. And one of the most interesting moments was understanding the roots of the Canadian cannabis movement, which is precisely in Vancouver and BC in general. It's important to identify the culture that exists there. Of course, North America, it was linked to prohibition, and some of the prohibitionist moments in Canada happened in parallel with some in the US, and a lot of interesting things happened. And through this investigation and my active participation as a consumer activist, businessman, recreational consumer, but also medical consumer, well, I start to understand this culture a little bit better. It's a very deep and alluring culture. One of the most important moments of the Canadian urban space was when around 1905, 1910, one of the first prohibitions kicked in. It was the prohibition of opium. Due to a series of events, the Asian community was stigmatized, the community that was migrating to that area of Canada, and then some things happened. Citizen groups would go into the Asian neighborhoods in Vancouver, and they started to cause troubles. There were riots. They were breaking the windows. They attacked the Asian community. And then they discovered the famous opium dens, which you've probably seen on photos. These people smoking from the opium pipe and so on. And that is the first act of prohibition in Canada, the Opium Act Prohibition, 1905, 1908. And that is the precedent for cannabis prohibition. This is important because after some years, there was some regulation against the Asian community so that they would stop studying medicine. And then the US, William Branham Harris and Harry Anslinger, which in parallel in the United States, they started to attack marijuana. They stigmatized Mexicans. In fact, Hearst owned a very large farm, 1 million hectares, they say, in the state of Chihuahua. This ranch was invaded by Pancho Villa, and because of his money and his influences, he started a campaign to promote a stigma against the Pancho Villa group, against Mexicans, etc. It's an interesting story. And then in modern times, what I can say as a witness living in Canada, well, I can talk about how cannabis has occupied public spaces, urban spaces at all times. Something that I think is deep and essential is that, in contrast to other industries, and this is not often talked about because it might seem irrelevant, but compared to other industries, cannabis comes from a movement. It represents a global movement of prohibition, of access to health. It's medicinal, it's also recreational. And then, since it's a movement from many places around the world, well, this affects how regulations in the US, Canada, and Mexico are so complicated. It's not easy to move from a social movement into an industry and to try and regulate something that might be apparently very simple on the surface. You know, it's just a plant. But No, in fact, it turns out that it's extremely complicated. And I I was hearing one of the speakers talk about bud tending and bud tenders. When in Canada, I worked in the legal industry, but also in the illegal industry. So I was a bud tender for a while there, and this character of the bud tender, they used to be dispensaries for many years that were tolerated before outright regulation, and now they're just retail stores. Canada has over 1,700 cannabis retail stores, and through this interaction between consumers, patients, although the cannabis system in Canada is online, a lot of patients go to the retail stores as well. And that's when you start discovering the myth of the plant, the myth that goes between anecdote and science and prohibition and pleasure, the cursed plant, as some people say. And, in having these encounters with consumers and by visiting different urban spaces in Victoria or Vancouver, other places around British Columbia, well, it's very easy to identify how cannabis starts to take these spaces. First, through the movements on the street, as has happened here in Mexico in recent weeks as well. There are spaces where people start to gather to consume. In Mexico, there's a huge stigma, unfortunately, and these spaces start to grow and they start to penetrate the urban space, the social space, and they start to interact with society at large. And that's why we decided to talk about the New Amsterdam Cafe. It's a social space, no doubt, but it's also a cultural space. It's an inclusive space for cannabis consumers, and it's been so for many years in Canada. And this space for consumption, it's a place, it's a cafe where you can go. And it's very similar to many cafes here in Mexico City in the Roma or Condesa neighborhoods, but it's a space where people are consuming cannabis. Those of you who've been there know what I'm talking about. Everybody's consuming, very relaxed, different methods of consumption, but more than that, it represents a space of no prohibition, a space of inclusion, a space of no stigma, and a space that represents a different culture. In the Hastings street on Vancouver, which is an icon in the Canadian cannabis movement, next to the Amsterdam Cafe, you can find the Cannabis Culture Center that used to host the famous Cannabis magazine. The Marijuana Party was founded there as well, the Canadian Party. And that building, that urban space that hosts the New Amsterdam Cafe and the Cannabis Culture Center, well, it represents this movement, which is participatory and inclusive, and all of the expressions that manifest there. In the Amsterdam Cafe, there are yoga activities, there are educational activities, some art exhibits, not all of them related to the industry or to cannabis. Nevertheless, the space has been tolerated. They've tried to close it many times, but it surged as a pillar of the cannabis community in Canada and Vancouver specifically. However, these kinds of spaces in other places in Canada are forbidden. They're not legal as such. Canada does not contemplate the legalization of spaces where you can go to consume cannabis, or a restaurant where you can go to eat a dish that has been cooked with cannabis. That is still not included in the law. It's an interesting topic. The status of legalization in Canada has been mentioned here in the forum. And Canada has three different stages in its history of medical legalization. And then on October 2018, Canada legalized recreational marijuana. And the industry was already there, but now there's more focus on the recreational side. Cannabis is also a meeting point. and it has to do with information and education. Those of us who are cannabis consumers or who directly or indirectly participate in the business, we can tell that the products and the culture is something serious that requires a lot of education. This space that we're having here, well, there should be more done about that. We need more academic documents, books, journals, magazines that talk about what the industry is in all seriousness, that talks about the stigma and the work that needs to be done through education. If there's no education and no information in the world of cannabis, the stigma will remain and the myth will remain, the prohibitionist myth, this information about this plant that is actually wonderful and has great potential in many different areas of life. The New Amsterdam Cafe, throughout this entire adventure, this journey, well, I've witnessed one of the most interesting movements, and I'm talking about the legacy growers. These are the people who, for many years, belonged to the illegal cannabis market, but now with the new regulations and the new legalization, some of those have tried to move into the legal sphere in accordance with Canadian law. But the culture of the legacy growers and the farms and the quality of their products, how they interacted with their community, how they contribute to their communities, especially when we're talking about violent groups, well, that's an important side of Canadian cannabis culture. I had the opportunity to meet with legacy growers. I was invited to meet them, or I was just crashing their meetings. But it's very interesting to see how, when it comes to the product and when it comes to the business, when it comes to access, we start to see a really important movement from the legacy growers who do not completely agree, just like the activists, with the Canadian cannabis industry. They don't agree the focus on business, on profits, on stocks, of the talk of an international industry. And you may agree or disagree with them, but the important thing is that this culture and this tradition in the Gulf Islands, Vancouver Island, and the northern regions has has permeated access to information and cannabis education. Going to different retail stores and different dispensaries, I believe that this culture gets conveyed because you can break the stigma when people go into these spaces for consumptions, spaces like the New Amsterdam Cafe, or when people go to a cannabis retailer. They can see the culture, the preferences, they can express their consumption habits. A lot of people are scared of cannabis retail, you know, when they go in there. A lot of people go in there and they discover a whole new world. And all of us who participate directly or indirectly in the cannabis industry anywhere in the world, we have a responsibility, a cultural responsibility, a responsibility of respecting the plant and of informing and educating people all the time. I'd like to talk about some things that I also perceive about Mexico that may be interesting. And they're interesting points in terms of the development of the industry. There's a movement in North America that has been going on for many years, and it has gone mainstream now. So we need to understand how the plant itself and its tradition and its culture undergoes different stages, and it affects society in different ways. Unfortunately, the stigma persists. There is a stigma in Canada. You can see it many times. Nevertheless, in countries such as Mexico, the stigma is a lot worse. It's a very strong stigma. A lot of people associate it with health. They think about addiction. They think about prohibition. They think about crime, which will continue until we have clear regulation. And that has to do with the responsibility that we have of creating a cultural, academic, informative movement so that the plant can finally arrive, so to speak. I think that a lot of these social and urban experiments that are going on in North America have to do with this. Probably California, Colorado, Washington, Nevada might have more experience. When it comes to Canada, as I've said about Mexico, cannabis culture in Mexico will continue to be a socio-economic experiment. In Canada, I don't think there's enough evidence. And if this economic experiment, this legalization experiment has been successful or not, it's still too early to tell what its impact has been on society, on different communities, on the industry, and so on. And I think it is our responsibility to talk about this legalization process openly, trying to avoid the stigma. I've talked a lot about this, and speaking more specifically about Mexico now, I think Mexico should legalize or regulate cannabis gradually, including a lot of information and getting rid of a lot of the speculation that exists around the industry. As I said at the start, it's a movement that goes from the medicinal industry, then there's also the recreational industry, and finally it goes mainstream, as it has gone mainstream in many parts around the world. That should be the wish, but always being careful about the culture and about the movements, and in Mexico, taking care of the small communities that participate in the industry. I'm talking about the growers, for example. So thank you so much for this time. I think that all of us who are here should join efforts. We should have a new conversation about cannabis. That's our responsibility. And from our trenches, we should do that. We should respect the plant and provide information to society.
Gracias, Jorge, por tu participación.
Thank you, Jorge, for your
La
participation.
siguiente participante de
The
esta
next
mesa
speaker
es
on this
Daniel
panel
Serutiaspinel,
is Daniel Serutiaspinel.
quien es fundadora de Canal Latino.
She is the founder of Canal Latino, an educational
Y los beneficios
community,
en Estados Unidos para los
and she talks about cannabis benefits for
Adelante,
Latino.
Ceruti, por favor.
Go ahead, Danielle.
Hello, good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank Zan and everyone and the anthropology department of the faculty and all of the people who have joined us today. My name is Daniel Serutiaspinel. I'm Venezuelan American and a citizen of the world. I am creative art director. I do PR. I'm an author. I'm an activist. I am very patient. I'm a patient and I'm also a mother of cannabis users. So because of all of this different set of circumstances as an activist, I have lived different experiences, but one of the things that has had the most influence in me is the existence of cannabis. To me, this has been a very positive change in my life. 10 years ago, I was a mother who worked a lot, was dependent on many drugs, and I had taken my son to many doctors because autism. I'm also an artist because obviously, where would these genes come from? But anyway, this has become a superpower for me. I was looking for information to help him and myself. And I'm an expert in communication, so I did a lot of research about everything. I use to work for different TV companies, Telemundo and others, and I was always looking for information that could help my kid. Because I thought that by doing that, I was giving my son the best chance in life to be part of society with the use of medication. that they were not really acting as expected, and on the contrary, they had terrible side effects. The only thing that he was that he was dope, but he was not improving. And he was also at the risk of death. And many times, doctors don't tell you that. So when I moved into Colorado in 2003, that's when I found a new medicine, a plant that to me became essential. The thing is that when I discovered cannabis, I'm a Latin, remember? So how am I going to tell my mother that I was giving marijuana to my son, or that I was consuming marijuana? It was a very difficult conversation. It was like I was receiving the devil in my home, because our cultures have received the worst type of propaganda, propaganda that is harming us. And we all know that racial discrimination and interests that were behind the hate campaign against the plant. But anyway, this is how we started to see how the media are repeating those stories, those narratives, and they're promoting a campaign against humanity. And that's what I call it, because willingly or not, the economic interest, fear, the lack of education of people who are responsible for those campaigns have caused several serious health world problems. For instance, the World Health Organization has a manual as of how to treat media communication of health matters. And let us see just a few examples that I wanted to bring you today. And obviously my chapter is going to be based around this. And I want us to understand what it's been really like and the communication that we have had so far about this plant and about its capability to improve the life quality of people. Let us begin, and it says here. When you are informing people, you need to interpret the statistics in a correct and accurate way. You must resort to the use of information sources that are authentic, reliable, and reputable. And the third point that I added, no spontaneous comments should be added, innocent if you may, but that could reinforce prejudice. Let us remember that those are the guidelines that are necessary for communicating health matters, guidelines by the United Nations, the World Health Organization. So with these 3 points, we can see that legalization of cannabis has never respected those parameters. It hasn't changed. Let's start with statistics. Statistics of death because of cannabis consumption is still 0. Nobody has died of cannabis consumption. Nobody says that, but people don't say it. Reliable sources that we should use do exist nowadays if you know how to look for them. If you follow the right people, and we stop criminalizing the plant. Rafael Mechuro, Lumi Hanu, Sunil Agawad, the anthropologist doctor. Sorry, the pronunciation is difficult.
La traba, como decimos en Venezuela. Pero este último.
But this last doctor, he is a doctor and anthropologist who speaks about how the endocannabinoid system suffers and is affected when there's a lack of equilibrium. And he proves that this plant has been in our lives ever since the Himalayan mountains were created. It's been here forever. In the US, our patents 663507 in the US that shows cannabis is a neurotransmitter, can be used as a neurotransmitter. So why don't we use what the right research we have? On the other hand, spontaneous comments that the guidelines refer to, we have many people from the US government who have said things such as, I'm sorry, it's just, I cannot stop laughing because they have said so many things. They even said in front of a court and under oath that they have consumed cannabis and they became bats because they smoked marijuana. Come on, for crying out loud. Where's the ethics that is necessary for the media to work in favor of society instead of against it? And by the way, the US expert on cannabis since 1938 and until 72 was Jay Monch, who declared to the tribunal under oath that he had smoked marijuana and that he had transformed into a bat. Those are real things that exist on the web. President Nixon also said that he wanted to hit marijuana in the vagina. Just imagine how much hate against human beings he was depicting. So all of the diseases that could be treated nowadays. Ethan Kuso is another doctor who said that a lack of balance in the endocannabinoid system is responsible for a very long list of diseases that we suffer nowadays. The fact that human beings have an endocannabinoid system proves that there's a very close relationship between the plant and our human development processes. Dr. Alan White, the anthropologist I referred to before, the doctor, he said how the system and the crop is one of the first crops that we human beings need and that it has been developing amongst us. So this is establishing the idea that we have grown cannabis forever, but also the fact that we have an endocannabinoid system in the body is because we have consumed it ever since we have existed. So let us remember that we need to know how to obtain the right sources of information, because anybody nowadays can say anything. There are so many blogs, YouTubers, and people can say whatever they think, but we really need to be careful in finding the right type of source, especially regarding this subject. We need to rely on science. The development of art has always, in our opinion, it reminds us of the beauty, but also about the power of imagination. The art of communication it's an art. So as a show of cannabis art, I can say that the pipes that were unearthed from the William Shakespeare House in London, they contain cannabis. Chemical analysis was made after the researchers presented the hypothesis that Sonnet 76 and the journey in my head by this other author could have been making reference to cannabis and use. And this is how we discovered that other artists in the past used it. We can name an endless list of artists and uses of cannabis because there are 25,000 products that are biodegradable that can be produced with the plant. So imagine that. The possibilities are endless. Cannabis arts nowadays have an enormous amount of artists that are getting inspiration from pre-Hispanic times, and they are creating spectacular pipes. You don't want to use them because they are so beautiful. You just want to stare at them. Arts, the music. This is all related, not only with the recreational consumption, but also they speak about the medicinal benefits of the plant. Speaking of Canada, in 2019, Miss Canada was wearing her gala suit inspired in the marijuana plant. That's for Miss Universe contest, which I thought was spectacular. So cannabis is everywhere because it never stopped being with us. There were just barriers, but there will always be in many artists, communicators, musicians, poets, and scientists who will be supporting it. The people who want this plant to be beneficial for everyone, and we want the right to communicate, a human right to use the plant to be able to have a better life quality. I invite everyone to do your own research, get your own education, and be better communicators and be better creators so that we can change the world and improve the health and human communication, not only because of us, because the next generations, they also have a right and they don't deserve to live the same life that we have been living in, because we want them to go further. That's what we want. My name is Serutiaspinel, and I'm a cannabis communicator working to destigmatize cannabis by art and communication media. My work is based on education and looking at ways in which to improve life quality for the benefit of all Hispanic communities. As an artist, I use the whole plant to benefit from everything it has to offer. Thank you, everyone. And let me show you before I conclude, speaking about what we said before the book covers. This is my book, the first cannabis recipe book in Latin America, written by a Latin woman. And I also create these pamphlets. Not only do we include the plant, but also the seeds, because we believe in Latin America, we are not at the level of the flower, but at of the seed. Thank you, everyone.
Gracias, Daniel, por tu participación.
Thank you, Daniel, for your presentation. Now,
Vamos con la sesión de preguntas.
we will start with the Q&A.
En la sesión de alguna pregunta,
If there are any questions,
o también
you can write them on the chat, as well as on the YouTube. And Emilio and myself will be coordinating the Q&A. I will be paying attention to the written ones and Emilio the live ones. So we have enough time. And the speakers, if they want to go into the in-depth discussion, we can do that. So, Victor Callejas, welcome. And please go ahead with your question. We cannot hear you. And could you start by saying who this question is meant for? Hello, everyone. I apologize. Hello, everyone. Wonderful presentations. The truth that I feel fascinated, because guess what happens with somebody who is not so involved in cannabis? This has happened to me. I have been hooked by each one of the presentations.
No, pero hablaron del
Because
arte.
sometimes you pay way too much attention about the medicinal use, but now that you speak about how it's been part of art and many other things, I feel inspired. But my question is, for any of the presenters, here in Mexico City, where can you buy the active elements of cannabis to use it for medicinal purposes? Because I have grown my own plants and I do it as best as I can, and I follow YouTube videos and I use extracts, but I don't know if I'm doing it right. Is there any place in Mexico City where you can go and get better information, buy the product, learn, or find cannabis medicine that's already been processed? And congratulations, everyone. Thank you, Victor. Who would like to answer? Maybe Jorge? Or some of the other speakers who have more experience in Mexico, particularly Mexico City. Jorge, would you like to answer that question? What is it that you can get? What is the quality like? Well, Victor Callejas, to answer your question, even though the medicinal cannabis regulation has been approved yet, the truth is that there's no market yet that's been developed, or not that is considered to be completely legal. There's a gray market that is very large, but from patients' organizations, they're very much concerned because there are no quality standards in this gray market, and it can be dangerous. But there are other organizations like AMEM, which is the self-growth and consumption in Mexico. They have manuals as to how to do the extraction. They start with self-supply as not for marketing purposes, but for personal use. Maybe that is a place for you to start a mem, for its acronym in Spanish, and there you could find somebody to help you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I would like to add that I know that they also offer legal help because, as Adrian had said, the regulations are very new and you're going to need to know the law. Maybe you will need a habeas corpus for your production, but you should also get some legal advice from a mem, especially regarding legal purposes, so that you can do this as safely, legally safely as possible. Hermilo. Let's see if there are any written questions. Adrian Jimenez wrote on the chat, in Mexico, the cannabis Mexican movement considers the industry as one of the parties that are responsible for the regulation to move forward, but they're not defending the human rights of people who already grow and consume because they only care about their own interest. And there's a question for Jorge Rubio. How can we make certain that the industry helps in a change of perception instead of fostering stigma? Jorge, could you help us with that question? Maybe he had internet connection because I got problems because I cannot see him. He's no longer in the meeting. Apparently he left. Would somebody else like to answer if somebody has knowledge?
Mira, yo creo que voy a tomar un poquitico el atrevimiento una vez más.
Well, once again, I'm not Mexican, but I have worked with Mexican foundations for 5 years. Oscar Salud, an organization for doctors. And I think this is one of the most difficult things to discuss right now because the regulation is brand new. One that is not very well defined. In the next few months, we will see whether we can kick off. There are certain licenses, things that have moved forward, but still, it is going to take some time. Some of the changes that have taken place in Mexico happened as well in Colorado and in other places in the US and Canada. So I think that you should also be paying attention to what is happening in other countries because the history is repeating itself in different places. Thank you, Daniel. Marty, please go ahead.
Thank you. And it was a pleasure to hear all the presenters, and I appreciate all the work and the inspiring words that you shared with us. So I have two questions. One is for the first presenter. I believe he's still around on the call. The study and the issue about museums. So one question I'm curious about, are you familiar with any work, or could you expand on different ways you actually measure to what extent when visitors see exhibits about cannabis that they actually contribute to destigmatization? So I'm just curious about any thoughts about that or suggestions for methodology. And then for mi amiga Danielle, I appreciate your work and it's great to see you again. I have two kinds of questions. One is that this came up earlier, maybe yesterday and earlier today. As a person who knows a bit about Colorado, any suggestions or thoughts about what Mexico could do differently to not replicate any bad approaches to cannabis regulation or cannabis culture that exist in Colorado, because they're at an earlier stage than us. And the second question for you, earlier, I remember hearing about a documentary that you were working on that was really important. Could you give us a little update or some details about that documentary film?
¿Quieres, Daniel, contestar y luego?
Daniel, would you like to answer that? And then Emilio, you could perhaps answer something related to what you are researching now. I know that this is not connected directly to cannabis, but it's a methodology that you're using anyway. So Daniel. Perfect, thank you. Yes, I think that there are so many things that we could be doing differently considering the new regulation. And there are many things that have to happen differently because the Mexican community is not the same as the Colorado community. The people in community, the Colorado community were perhaps better prepared at some point to receive cannabis. In Mexico, there's still a lot of fear and resistance and lack of good information. So a lot of education has to be promoted. That's the first step that has to be taken in Mexico. More awareness, more education, so that some things can be normalized and so that people can also get into the business to grow, to process the plant without any fear. Now, in terms of the documentary that we were shooting, it's still ongoing. We are collecting testimonies of mothers, especially cannabis mothers who would like to tell their story in Latin America, because it's very important also to be able not only to tell our own stories as mothers, but also to speak about the abuse there is in hospitals when you are presented as a cannabis mother, or gynecologists when mothers are about to give birth. There's a lot of violence against cannabis mothers. So we want to take our own sweet time so that we can reach as many people with the best information possible. And we were documenting the violence doctors exert against women and against the human right that we women have to treat our bodies with whatever we consider is best for our bodies. Thank you, Daniel. Emilio. Sorry. Emiliano, you were about to answer the museography question. Well, speaking from the methodological perspective, there is no work that I know of that measures the impact of the audiences, but if, for instance, I am writing a thesis to study social representations of audiences, and this is done through focus groups and interviews, I think it is important to compare and contrast the vision that museology can contribute with, but that the audiences are really also contributing in how they are receiving. When I was at the museum talking to Julio Senil, it is important to say about the role of women in those places, because this is something that was discussed yesterday. If there's a female consumer, it would seem that it has to do with her sexuality, and since she is consuming, she is a free woman and open to anyone's sexual advances. And actually, when you read articles or advertising, there's a lot of sexualization of women and marijuana consumption. So it would be interesting to understand the vision of the audiences, because with this, we could come up with proposals to improve the museological part. Thank you. Thank you, Emiliano. The next question on the chat is also for you. What type of dissemination is the museum doing? How do they advertise themselves? Can you share the website? Because of the pandemic, we're very limited, but anyway, I'll give you the website the Facebook website and the website itself so that you can see the information. I'm sharing it on the chat. Aaron, do you have any other questions from the audience? No, I think you have more questions from the chat. Okay. Nancy is saying, could you speak more about the trading of marijuana products? How is it done in your countries? Is it a more personal consumption, or do people buy weed on the web? Where is it that you find the most demand? Where do you buy, and where is the most demand in your countries? Let's start to answer that question. And I saw another question, where to buy this book. You can buy it on Amazon and at the museum. You can also go to the museum and buy the book. So 2 in 1. I live in Colorado, in Denver, Colorado. In here, cannabis consumption is obviously recreational and also medicinal, which is the important thing for me. And when I started using, it was only for medicinal purposes, but then right now, there is more recreational consumption than medicinal one. One of the problems that the cities are facing, the small cities in Colorado are facing, is the fact that most of the stores want recreational purposes because they make more money and they can collect more money, and it's also producing more taxes. The medicinal shops have more subsidies to help patients. So more people are, the people who want to work with medicinal purposes have to focus on the recreational use, and this is an obstacle for patients. So instead of seeing what is the product that you sell the most, you have to see how is it being used. And in Colorado as well as in California, people are using it more for recreational purposes, as well as in other states. Thank you, Daniel. Just to clarify, what museum did you refer to? The Cannabis Museum. Mexico City, you mean? Yeah, Mexico City. Go to Mexico City and buy the same link Emiliano has given you. You can ask the recipe book there. Thank you, thank you. Emilio, do you have any other questions or comments before we pass the floor to Marty? Yvonne Alvarez is saying that she would like to know what is the perspective that the speakers have regarding the idea of problematizing consumption, because many of the resistances start from privilege and other experiences are obscured because of privilege. So is it important to politicize the consumption, and how could we speak of the cons? While you think of an answer, I pass the floor to Marty, and then whoever wishes to answer. Go ahead, Marty.
Thank you again. I appreciate a chance to ask another 2 questions. And really they're comments to bring attention to specific points Danielle mentioned. One point, which I think is really significant, she mentioned this idea early on in her life when, you know, the devil going into your household as a phrase to represent cannabis in our own families and what does it mean. And I think this kind of language is really important because it helps us tell stories about ourselves and reflect on our own relationship with this plant and the process of cannabis destigmatization. And it helps us kind of create space for other people to share stories about their relationship and how they've grown with cannabis. I just want to acknowledge that kind of reflexivity is really important, and we should take possession of that and make it front and center in our chapter contributions. The second point that she mentioned I want to raise that has been glossed over, we've been hyper-focused on cannabis, medicinal cannabis, recreational cannabis, And there has been little to no discussion about the other side, which is hemp, the non-psychoactive portion of this cannabis plant and this cannabis process. We could organize in the future another set of 2 volumes just on hemp, its global significance, hemp and the 25,000 plus products that could come from this plant. And again, how hemp is contributing to counter narratives and pulling us together across borders to create some new cultures of hemp and hemp education.
Me encantaría, si me dejan.
Adelante,
Si me dejan,
adelante.
Let me, I'd love to say something. Yeah, go ahead, go ahead. We have until 3.
Perfecto. Es que creo que tiene también que ver un poco con la pregunta que hicieron anterior y el
This is
comentario
related
que
to
estaba
a
haciendo.
previous question and also to Marty's comment.
Cuando tratamos de pensar en la regulación del
When we
consumo
try to think about
del cannabis,
regulating consumption
solo
of
hablamos de la
cannabis,
regulación del consumo de la marihuana, sino
we're not
también
just
de la
thinking
regulación
about
del
consumption of
cannabis.
marijuana, we're also talking about hemp,
Federal aquí en los
which
Estados
is
Unidos,
already
se pueden
regulated at a federal level in the US.
desde casas, ropa,
And you can make
cualquier cantidad de
clothing,
comida, o sea,
all
hay
kinds of
muchísimas
things,
funciones
fuel.
de eso.
There's
Y
like
esa
so
precisamente
many
es la pregunta
uses
cuando
for hemp.
traemos
And
consumo a la mesa, cuando decimos
when we
vamos a
talk about
legalizar
consumption, about legalization, when we put it on the table, legalizing
se
this
habla
plant in
de
a
que todo el
country,
mundo va a fumar
we're not talking
marihuana,
about
que todo el
everybody
mundo va a
smoking
fumar.
marijuana, everybody
Precisamente
having a
crear
joint. We're
regulación,
talking about
legislaciones que
creating
permitan que nuestros hijos no
laws,
entren a los
legislating,
que el consumo
so
sea
that
normal, porque pasa en lugares donde no
consumption
afecta,
is
donde no es
perceived
observada.
normally because it happens in places where it doesn't
La
affect any other human being.
Eso es lo que
This is the
creo que
point of
desde el punto de vista
regulation.
de cómo se deberían plantear los problemas.
This is the point of view that we should take when we think about tackling these problems. How can cannabis help in construction, medicine, clothing? There are so many industries that could benefit from this plant. For example, if Mexico makes cars, for example, we are going to follow in the steps of Henry Ford building those cannabis cars, because we know that hemp is a lot stronger than iron. So we need to find a place to correctly consume cannabis and marijuana. Thank you, Danielle. Do any of the participants want to say anything specifically about Nancy's question about talking about commercializing with marijuana products? What's that like in your country, in Canada, in the US? Do you buy online? Where is there more demand? If you could talk about that, that would be great. Maybe Scott, you'd like to say something? I think you're in Germany, or perhaps Marty wants to say something about this.
I'm happy to say something, but can you restate the question? I was texting my student who made a documentary film about hemp, and I want to share it in the chat, but I'm waiting to get the link. So can you restate the question?
Súper. Dice, Nancy preguntó, ¿pueden ampliar el tema comercial?
Nancy says, can you expand on the topic about commercializing marijuana products? What's it like in your countries? Do you go yourselves? Do you buy online? Where is there more demand?
That's a great question. I can provide some comments. I know there might be others that could augment my comments. So I'm not a regular consumer of cannabis, but I definitely analyze it and study it for research and creative purposes. In Colorado, we have so many shops. Like we have more marijuana shops than Starbucks in Colorado. So I can walk, half a mile and I have a few options for marijuana. The consumption and purchasing of products varies widely. I think there's been a tradition of consuming flower, the marijuana plant in, joint form or buying grams, but more and more there's a diversification of consumption habits, especially along gender lines. Women are known to use less flour and more other products like topicals and other things for different recreational purposes and medicinal purposes. So here we're very fortunate. You could say we're overwhelmed with cannabis in a good way, and we hope maybe Mexico will catch up in a way that's suitable for its culture. But I know others probably can provide some additional details.
Gracias, Marty. ¿Alguien quiere agregar algo a esta pregunta?
Thank you, Marty. Does anybody want to add anything to this? No? Okay. So,
yeah, I would add.
Adelante, Scott.
Okay, just weed is illegal in Germany. It may be legalized soon, though. It looks like there are things happening that may result in it being legalized. Medical weed is legal in Germany. It has been for about 4 years. People in Berlin, there are private, long-established private networks of illegal distribution. Otherwise, people go to a few different parks in the city where there are, in some cases, very open and active markets. That's a quick version.
Gracias, Scott.
Thank you, Scott. I'm going to read an answer from Jorge Rubio. He says, I think that the industry in Mexico should be through small and medium regional products that can participate in the legal supply chain with an access to the market. The industry should educate not just in terms of making business, but we should have real data from hemp and cannabis industries. And this is the answer to the question that was asked earlier. I sent the question to him via chat, and that was his response. Now, Hermilo, go ahead and let me know if there are more questions in the chat. Remember, you can ask your questions via YouTube as well. Thank you. So there was a question earlier from Yvonne Alvarez about privilege, class privilege, race, gender privilege, urban privileges as well. So she's asking if you think it's necessary to politicize marijuana consumption, and how should this be done? I'd like to say something. Go ahead. Thinking about my thesis, I think about decentralized spaces, including museums. At first, I had a hard time with the centrality of the museum because it's located in downtown Mexico City. And an interesting way to think about this problem, there's a photo archive from 2014 by a photographer in so-called rehabilitation farms. And this highlights some of the differences of going to a museum versus suffering the stigma and lacking the tools to question these ideas of production and consumption. So a way to think about this problem is similar to what I said at the end of my presentation, and that is to think about re-socializing. At the end of the day, these people carry the stigma, and they will have that stigma no matter what they do, but it's very important to get these testimonies. Thinking about intersectionality, it's important to do that. they're not going to have the same importance as a theoretical space or an academic space, such as a museum. Thank you, Emiliano. Would anybody like to say something about that? Nancy's question? No, Yvonne. Yvonne is her name.
Maybe I can take a stab at this question. I think in some of these comments I made yesterday, I mean, we can agree that cannabis as a commodity, cannabis as a process, cannabis as a cultural phenomenon is hotly contested and highly politicized. That's to me clear. And I think when we bring it back to ourselves and our own work, we need to continuously answer the question, who is not at the table, you know, having their views represented? And what can we do to make a table of discussion, of art-based research? What can we make it to be more welcoming and recognize the diversity of views and backgrounds, whether faith-based backgrounds or class or region? And so this is extremely difficult in a situation where we're relying on technology, we're relying on a computer, a Wi-Fi connection, and most people don't have that available to them. And so I think we have to just reflect on these and think, what is our role to make a cannabis recognize it's politicized, and then what can we do about it to make it all inclusive to whatever degree we think is reasonable.
Gracias, Marty. ¿Alguien más en el chat,
Thank you, Marty. Anybody else on the chat, Hermilo? Nobody else. Hermilo, any other questions? Anything else? Go ahead, Adrián. Marty and Daniel talked about the role of the industry and how it's not just marijuana, it's also hemp, it's also the medicinal aspect. And I think each of these different aspects has to be addressed in parallel. And they do require different means of production. And I read an article recently in the Cáñamo magazine, Hemp, that about how in a county in California, the county had forbidden hemp growing because the pollen would fly and it would affect the growing of marijuana grown for consumption. And there's an area here in Oaxaca that where 4 or 5 strains of cannabis have been identified that have grown there. I know that cannabis is not endemic to America. It didn't originate there, but these strains that we have identified in Oaxaca have a high percentage of THC. But now there's an attempt to bring in hemp production now that it starts to be legal. But in the communities, we also see this risk that when you're growing hemp, for example, in states that have historically produced cannabis, this can be harmful for the communities. So what was this discussion like? How did it take place? How can it be addressed now? You know, thinking about the social responsibility that the industry needs to have.
Let me see if I understand the question, especially with your last phrase of social responsibility. So are you suggesting that when you have medicinal cannabis with THC, recreational cannabis growing, and then nearby you have traditional hemp plants, that we need to be responsible and keep those separated, because we don't want the hemp seeds to mix with the other seeds because it wrecks the crops. So I think if that's what I understand about you saying being socially responsible, I agree that needs to be done, or the hemp sector will fail. And I know in Colorado, we have a blossoming hemp sector, and this issue doesn't necessarily hit your point directly, but we're getting more and more knowledge about appropriate agricultural practices to make sure that the hemp sector grows more, and we have the manufacturing abilities to process the plant into appropriate products. And we have a long way to go, but our sector is growing. What's super interesting is that the cannabis sector and the hemp sector, they fight and they don't get along because, yeah, exactly, because some people want the hemp sector to be meant for, products that are not just for, consumption, or not just for medicine. They want it for other products. And I recognize and know in Colorado, there was a attempt by the marijuana industry to co-opt and take control of a hemp research center through the Department of Agriculture. And now there's a lawsuit from the hemp sector against the cannabis sector to stop them and to depoliticize hemp research. So these are just some things to share with you about potential problems to look forward to as Mexico goes into these areas. But I teach a global class in the Netherlands about the hemp sector in the Netherlands, and it's a fascinating area, and the Europeans are way more advanced in terms of the production of hemp for different purposes. And so I'm happy over time to share resources and learn from others their interests in what we could do to support the hemp sector at the global and national levels.
Gracias, Marty. Daniel.
Ya, me gusta
Thank you, Marty. Daniel? Yeah, I saw in the chat a question about culture, and it's worth mentioning that the culture in this continent, well, they adapted new plants over the centuries before the Spanish arrived. Avocado, many plants. I could tell you many plants. But we need to honor the plant. We need to be responsible. And this is important because, we need to acknowledge this. We need to put a lot of attention on this because it has a pretty big influence, a pretty big impact. And it's a connection with our ancestors. And now we're creating new types of implementations. Hermilo, anybody else in the chat? Yeah, on the same question from Nancy Orduño for Daniel. She asked Daniel, how do you get pulque with cannabis? Where do you get it in the USA? Well, the plant, the symbol does not exist in any of the temples or the rituals or the archaeological ruins. So people think that the influence is kind of a new thing. Yes, it's about the spirituality of the plant and trying to communicate that. And people who experience this have stronger words to say that because they're building a bridge to connect to the plant. So they can express the results that they have, and we can see the results of the actions that people take. Because each medicine that exists in nature has a function. And the healers, they learn about these plants, and they are capable of understanding this dialogue. It's about how can the plant respond to this or to that. I don't like the word shaman because we're focused a lot on science, and our ancestors, they said, we don't believe in gods, we believe in energies, and the plant has a certain vibration, a certain frequency. But this is part of the capacity of human beings. It's like somebody who's addicted to something and they get treatment and they have no experience with alcohol. I mean, there's an issue of understanding. So we need people who have used this, who have experienced this, who are involved in the rituals, because they can answer those questions. And the plant can tell you what direction you should go. When human beings are split, like with capitalism, everybody is defending their own position in opposition to the others. There is conflict. We need to find people who are connected to the plant and let and hear their recommendations. Thank you, Daniel. Hermilo, anything from the chat? Yes.
Sí, a ver, en el chat, José Alberto Briceño Sainz
José Alberto Briceño Sanz said something in the chat about Proposition 19, also known as the 2010 decree for regulation, controlling, and fiscalizing cannabis. This was a ballot proposal in California in November the 2nd, 2010, in state elections. And it's about legalizing several activities related to marijuana. This proposition fulfilled the requirements to be included in the state referendum, yes and 19. And after a closed referendum and surveys, no won with 53.5% of the votes. And then he adds, he shared a link in the chat. Recently, the sheriff of Mendocino County said that in recent weeks, the federal police department and the state police department did 28 interventions in the north of California to end illegal plantations in the area, which apparently are affecting the environment. These farms were contaminating the water in the area with pesticides, leftover oil, and he says that it sounds odd, but some companies have this kind of permit because their activities may affect the environment where they are. And these 28 marijuana plantations lacked these permits. Would the speakers want to say something about this, or would you want to add anything about these problems in California with regulating cannabis?
Yo quiero agregar algo referente a esto y es, por ejemplo,
I do want to add something about this.
hay que entender algo muy cierto también, que
We need to understand something that's true, which is that cannabis, marijuana, is not really legal in the US at a federal level. We need to keep that in mind. So these kinds of operations can happen at any moment. I used to work at a dispensary, and the police just came in, the federal police, one morning. They broke everything, they threw everything out because they got a call saying that we used pesticides, which we did not do. And we got a letter getting our license back, but we never got back the plants that they killed or anything else that they broke. This happens because we don't have regulation at a federal level to protect us. The issue with pesticides, well, the best thing to do, obviously, is to not use any pesticides when you grow. But when banks, and this doesn't happen in the cannabis industry right now, and a lot of industries use pesticides. It's not just about cannabis. So when you get approved for growing, you need to use the pesticides that are indicated to you. So we don't have federal level regulation about which pesticides you're allowed to use. You shouldn't use any pesticides. But what we need to do is to get legalization at the federal level so that we can defend these grows and also have better regulation about the pesticides that they may use.
I,
Thank you.
If it's appropriate, I'd like to comment also.
Yes, go ahead. Yes, we have
Thank
time,
you.
Mark.
Thank you. And I hope I'm getting the name right. Yosa Alberto, is that how you say your name?
Jose Alberto, yes. You got
Jose
it.
Alberto. So thank you for a great question. And the issue you raise has multiple levels. First of all, I'm from Marin County in San Francisco, which is 6 hours south of this golden triangle in California, which is, you could argue, the epicenter of the cannabis sector that was like underground. There's still a lot of farmers and people there that refuse to become licensed because they don't want to pay the money, or they don't agree that this crop, this magical, female plant should be regulated by Uncle Sam, by the government or by the state level government. So there's a lot of renegade farmers that are, small mom and pop farmers trying to do their best. And as Danielle said, yes, we have federal uncertainty. And so periodically there's invasions to capture these people. Now, the dirty secret of cannabis at the legal level, the dirty secret is that underneath the veneer, there's some major environmental problems. And the environmental problems is because the crop uses a lot of water and a lot of electricity, and you have issues of pesticide use. And so one of the problems that we face is, what can we do to build alliances, for example, with the climate justice movement, to make the cannabis sector be more environmentally friendly? Or, to what degree does an acre of cannabis or a pound of cannabis contribute to, affecting the ozone layer? So there's a lot of more research that needs to be done along multiple levels, the environmental concerns, but also creating space for people who want to be renegade farmers, to allow them to do their work safely in a protective way that doesn't harm the environment, but also recognizing they're swimming upstream against regulations that are working against them. And so these are all issues with a lot of moving parts, but they're ongoing. And I'm also interested to learn more about people's knowledge and what they think are the remedies to some of these issues.
I'd like to comment too that, like you mentioned before, this lawsuit that is up in northern and between the agricultural and the public health that's in Colorado. And hopefully this can go to the Supreme Court with a decision that will make a federal change to decide, who regulate or what level of regulation goes between, because, that's where, and then they're going to miss that third if they don't bring in this kind of the recognition of this plant itself on a cosmic level, which should be, probably socially would have a big influence with movements of, I noticed in Denver, we have the Church of Cannabis now, and there's a lot of people that recognize the spiritual side of the plant. And what kind of organizing are they doing?
Yeah, thank you for that comment.
Disculpa, acabo de mencionar que me cambié mi idioma.
I just realized that I switched languages. Hermilo, go ahead.
Bueno, en el chat también comentó de nuevo José Alberto Briceño.
Jose Alberto Briceño commented again in the chat that companies in California must have permits from the local government to grow test cannabis within each jurisdiction, and that cities and counties may do that for some of the activities. He also says that the California Bureau of Cannabis Control has banned the export of marijuana to other states. Then Alfredo Álvarez Padilla has a question. Perhaps one of the speakers can answer. What is the position of President Biden on legalization? It appears to continue to be controversial and politicized.
I can try to take again attempt to these. Number one, I really appreciate Jose Alberto bringing attention to California. Colorado is a small player in the sector. California, the economy alone is like the 10th strongest economy in the world, and so we should be paying attention to it. Unfortunately, our focus, I'm from California, but my research is in Colorado, but bringing attention to developments and trends in California is essential. The only difference, and this is sort of a way to boast about Colorado, it seems when Colorado unrolled its regulations for cannabis when we legalized, we did it much better than any other state, including California. So Colorado had the parts and the players to make the regulations and implement them in an effective manner. Whereas these other states, California, Washington, Oregon, didn't do it so well. And you could say internal fighting among cannabis representatives and stakeholders has created obstructions. And part of that could be that it's just California especially is such a massive state that, you know, it's hard to get it to agree on many things. And so some people use the language that California, the cannabis sector is a shit show because there's problems that they're trying to deal with. And about Biden, I haven't really been following it too much. I think you pointed out, the individual was Alfredo, that yeah, Biden, it seems maybe prior to the election, there's positive energy about maybe legalizing marijuana, but once the people get into office, they recognize, you know, similar to the comment about Mexico being a traditional Catholic, you know, a country, in the US, we do have this traditionalism and Christianity as an undercurrent. And I think there still is a prohibition ideology that entraps many of the people at the federal level. And so these are things that we're dealing with on a daily basis, but I'm hopeful.
Me gusta mencionar también, entonces, importante.
I would also like to mention how the Department of Agriculture at the national federal level is playing a role, right? The Soils Preservation Agency had a movie, Kiss the Ground, on Netflix. You haven't seen it? Watch it. It speaks about how the agricultural industry is now contributing to green gas and global warming and things. So they could do many changes in agriculture. And so if the cannabis regulation could find a path, it could also be another angle aside from public health. So there could be a better result. Right? Thank you, Daniel. So are there any other questions or comments? If not, with this we conclude. And the speakers, we will stay here. Yesterday we had a private session, and maybe today we could continue with the people who were not here yesterday. So any other questions or comments for the speakers? All right, then. I just conclude thanking the CISAN team who has been supporting us in a brilliant way. I thank the translators. And Marty, would you like to give us some final words before we continue with our inner circle meeting?
Sure. I have to tell people I have my lunch here, and it's been so hard to eat because I've been talking so much. So okay, I'm happy to provide some closing comments. Number one, I want to thank, and I'm glad Diego or someone mentioned this, I want to thank the interpreters for their work. It's been super helpful for me and other people who struggle with Spanish, so I appreciate the work they do. Also to recognize my university, 2 different offices funded the translation, my dean's office and then also the Office of Research Services. Cezanne, I want to thank the institution and of course all the presenters, really exciting, inspiring work. And in a way you can say that now the fun begins. We pull this stuff together into a coherent chapter that it might be like birthing a baby. So it's going to be challenging, but at the end of the day, we expect it'll be a contribution to a family of cannabis champions. And I'm looking forward to each of you educating myself and each other about how our work can push the cannabis research and arts-based work in new directions. And of course, I mentioned this yesterday, people should feel this is an ongoing discussion. So for participants and audience members, reach out to us if you have any information you want to share, or if you need any additional information from us. And I hope we can do this one day in person, hopefully near the beach, because it's nice to be near the water with some lovely cannabis nearby.
Gracias. Entonces, les pedimos a los y a las.
Thank you. So we're going to ask the speakers to stay on the call while we conclude with the YouTube live broadcast. We thank the attendees, and tomorrow we will meet at 10 Mexico City time once again. Thank you, everyone, and the rest, we stay here to work a little more. Thank you.
Miriam, ya vi que